No decision by the government, no act, no law, no legislation passed is more controversial than the kind that has to do with our civil rights and liberties, our freedoms and protections from the government. That social contract, even if people aren't using that term, that ultimately is what we're talking about with civil rights and liberties. What power do we give the government to tell us what freedoms we have and what freedoms we don't have, and can be punished if we try to exercise those freedoms anyways? So first, let's define civil rights and liberties. Civil rights are rights of fair and equal status and treatment. The right to participate in governments, making clear what it means to be a citizen. Civil liberties are the freedoms that citizens have to think and act however they want without the government limiting it, without the government abusing its power over you to limit the things you think and act and do in your life. However, sometimes the government is faced with a hard choice. Do we protect civil rights or liberties? Because sometimes the government can only choose one and the other one has to suffer. In the Constitution, there's an example in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment guarantees that people, citizens, have the right to to prohibit the federal government from establishing a national religion. So if the government starts to favor any religion over any other religion, the people have the right to stop that, to sue them. We can say, nope, you're playing favorites. You cannot favor one religion over another religion. However, there's also the Free Exercise Clause in that same First Amendment, which guarantees all people the right to hold any religious belief they choose. But one of the consequences of those two clauses is, what if one religious group believes that their religion is the only religion and that no other religion is true and therefore should be respected or protected by the law? Well, Free Exercise Clause says you can believe that. But the Establishment Clause says, well, you can believe that, but you can't do anything about it because the government cannot favor any religion over another religion. Another example of conflict that had to be resolved through an amendment is between states and federal government. If the federal government recognizes all citizens to be the same, well, what about the states? Do the states have to do that? Does a police officer in California have to respect the rights of someone from Texas? Well, according to the 14th Amendment, your civil liberties are protected no matter what state you are in, because the 14th Amendment extends the protection of the Bill of Rights against the actions of the federal government to the state and local governments, meaning the state and local governments have to respect and protect your constitutional rights the same way that the federal government does. And on that same topic, the 14th Amendment actually went even deeper in saying that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law, meaning however it decides to interpret the law, it has to interpret it that same way for all people. You can't punish one group of people, like say African Americans, in a different way than you do white Americans for the same law. That is a violation of your 14th Amendment rights, where all citizens are treated the same. There's no first-class citizens, there's no second-class citizens. According to the Constitution, there are just citizens, and they should all be treated the same way, no matter the circumstances. Now, what made the government pass the 14th Amendment was the end of the Civil War, when all of the slaves were freed, because the Supreme Court had already decided that the slaves were not citizens, but they were here. This was their home. There was no going back to Africa because they'd never even seen Africa. For generations upon generations, these African slaves were American slaves. Just because their skin color was black didn't make them any less American. So the 14th Amendment resolved that by just saying, if you were born in America, then you are an American. Also, it was trying to ease their transition from slavery into being fully active American citizens, able to get education and find jobs and participate in the government. But they were worried that the states in the South who used to own them as slaves would not treat them the same. So the goal of these new laws, these new amendments, was to end segregation, to make sure that there wasn't a separate society for blacks and whites. But it failed because, again, we had just finished the Civil War, and the North really didn't want to push the issue of equal rights and possibly risk another Civil War. So they just allowed the South to do what they wanted. And what the South wanted was segregation. So those civil rights in the short term failed after the Civil War because of the white-dominated governments in the South passing what is known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are the type of laws that segregate white people from black people in public spaces like restaurants, bathrooms, swimming pools, drinking fountains, schools. Anywhere that white and black people could intermingle in the South, there was a law saying you can't. If a black person is asked to move to another place or to not participate in a certain place, the black people were expected to do so. And this did not change until African Americans in the South rose up and forced the government to change by engaging in what is known as civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is when you break a law on purpose, intentionally, because it violates your beliefs of what is right. You believe it violates your rights and protections as a citizen, and you accept punishment. Understand, if you engage in civil disobedience, you will get punishment. You will go to jail. You will be fined because you broke the law. There's no get out of free because you're like, well, it violates my beliefs. I think that was wrong, so you can't punish me. No, you get punished. African Americans in the South broke these Jim Crow laws, and they were attacked, they were beaten, they were sent to jail. But they did it anyways because they believed that was the right thing to do. Because the alternative was to accept a society that treated black Americans like they weren't Americans. And they decided that was worse than getting beat, getting attacked, and sent to jail. One of the most famous acts of civil disobedience was carried out by a woman known as Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks got onto a bus in the South, and at the time, Jim Crow laws said, if you are sitting at the front of the bus and you are black, if a white person wants your seat, you have to move. If you don't move, you will be arrested. Well, Rosa Parks had lived her whole life under these laws until one day she said, no, I'm not moving. I just got off of work. I'm sitting on this bus. I sat down first. You're just getting on. There's a seat in the back. Go sit there. It's not that far. And that just, well, it was against the law. That was illegal. She broke the law, but she decided enough. I don't care about the law. That's wrong. And so she was arrested. And that was one of the major catalysts that eventually started the civil rights movement that was so successful in passing new laws over a decade later that ended segregation. Eventually, the government did get into the South and forced them to stop separating colors, but only because we, the people, citizens in the South, made them do it. However, to do that, the government had to limit people's rights. African Americans had their rights denied to them until the government came in and told white governments, you no longer have the freedom to treat people this way. You no longer have the freedom to believe that blacks are worse than you, that they don't deserve the same facilities and same freedoms as white people. So white people in the South, who were the ones in power, had their liberties, that freedom to act and think however they want without the government intervening, limited. They had some of that taken away from them. And why that had to happen, why the government sometimes limits individual liberties and rights, is to protect other citizens, to protect the nation as a whole. Because I think we can all agree that in this case, it was okay to limit one group of people's freedoms to make sure another people actually had freedoms, actually had rights. A more modern day example is affirmative action. So a couple decades ago, there was many laws and legislations passed to try to fight the effects of past discrimination. Because one effect of discrimination and Jim Crow laws is that for so long, many minorities, especially in the African American and Latino communities, were held down, held back. They didn't have access to all the opportunities that white communities did. For example, schools. African Americans in particular are very underrepresented. There's not as many of African American students as there are of other races of students like whites and Asians. So affirmative action rules told colleges you have to recruit a certain minimum of each kind of race. However, each university has a maximum capacity. They can't just invite unlimited numbers of students. So if they make more room for students of one race, that means they might have to reduce how much room there is for students of another race. So in recent news, there has been more and more lawsuits coming from Asian students who generally don't struggle to be represented well in college, getting rejected by colleges because there's no more room for their race group because they had to make room for another group. So this is an extremely tough decision. How should our government handle this? On one hand, we want to make sure that one group that has a disadvantage because of government abuse can be helped up to be working on the same playing field, to have the same opportunities as everybody else who didn't have disadvantages. But to do that, we've started to create disadvantages for other races facing new obstacles as a result of these other rules that are trying to help a different group of people. And I'm not sure there is a best option that will make everybody happy. So what does that compromise look like? We as a society are still figuring that out. But for now, that's all there is to know about civil liberties and rights. If you have any questions, please ask.